Good afternoon, everyone. Since I first moved to Lagos 8 years ago, I've had to come up with a quick and easy answer to the question I often get: what is life like here? Well, I usually say, if you can survive in Lagos, you can survive anywhere. I'm sure that if you are one of the 23 million or so people living here with me within this 1,000 square kilometers of surprisingly organized chaos, I imagine that you also share this feeling. Whether it's sitting for 5 hours on Ikorodu Road and hold up on your way to the airport, or maybe it's when you're trying to manage a migraine headache and the generator's blaring and there's music downstairs and your neighbor's having a naming ceremony and someone's trying to sell traditional medicine and it's just too much. We all have to survive here in Lagos. No be so. But every time I'm about feeling proud of myself for how well I can survive in Lagos, I have to stop and ask myself, could I do it on 500 naira a day? Could I do it if all the odds were stacked against me? With all due respect to Obi, who just spoke, resilience is the buzzword of the day. And for me, the urban poor are the people who are the most resilient. And everything that we need to learn about resilience, we can learn from the urban poor. I've spent 3 hours sitting at a round table in an air-conditioned Ikeja hotel trying to define resilience. But to me, all you need to do is go to a community like Ijora Badia on a day when there's waist-high flooding and see how people are actually keeping their lives going. They do it through a network of Paco bridges like this. They do it by using a car door as an impromptu boat. I know we were all impressed last year when we saw someone kayaking on Victoria Island during the flood, right? This person doesn't have a kayak. Instead, they're using a door. You can also see this kind of resilience when you go to a community like Otodobame after the eviction and forced displacement of 30,000 people, and you see how quickly the community starts recycling materials and rebuilding because they need to. Of course, they have to employ, and the youngest members of the community are also involved. And this was just a few days after the forced eviction of 30,000 people. I've also seen resilience when I walked up 4 flights of stairs to the Office of Civic Engagement, side by side with a dozen or more persons living with disabilities, most of whom I was walking with my 2 legs, and they were using their 2 arms to climb those 4 flights of stairs, with a repurposed skateboard, like you see here, strapped to their back. And that's how they normally navigate and get around the city. They don't have cars, they navigate, they go into public transport, they go into KK, they go into downfall, just like this. This is true resilience. So what does this tell us about how we should approach urban poverty and tackling urban poverty? Number 1, the urban poor are not victims, nor are they heroes, but they are survivors, and they are the agents of their own survival. They survive out of necessity, and we know that necessity is the mother of invention. As lifelong survivors, they've learned to capitalize on every opportunity, and this is a tremendous skill. This skill is the building block for tackling urban poverty. Number 2, there is nothing that we are doing in civil society that is going to single-handedly save, quote unquote, the urban poor or eradicate poverty. Charity helps at times of crisis. Charity helps after a forced eviction. Like here, after Otodobame eviction, we have people who are receiving basic needs because they've lost everything. And there is a time and a place for that. But if we want to really tackle urban poverty, what we need to do is recognize the survival skills that the urban poor already have and work with them to build on and improve on those skills. We need to increase their access to knowledge, to technology, and we need to material resources, and we need to work with them to combat the numerous shocks that constantly set them back and keep them just surviving rather than going on to thrive. Third, the current government and policy approach to tackling urban poverty is basically non-existent. Instead, what we have are laws, policies, and practices that are counterproductive, that constantly undermine the otherwise gradual process by which the poor accumulate wealth and would otherwise be able to move out of poverty. We have practices like forced eviction. Forced evictions that fail to recognize that slums and informal settlements are in fact an imperfect but an actual solution and response to the lack of affordable formal sector housing in the city. Forced evictions destroy investments, they destroy people's savings, they destroy what little wealth the poor have actually been able to accumulate. They cause homelessness, they lead to tremendous negative health consequences, they lead to death. This coffin is the coffin of a young man named Daniel Aya, who was shot during the forced eviction of Ototo Bame in April of 2017. A 22-year-old man who lost his life trying to save his home. They lead to the destruction of the futures for children. Will this child, who's now living in a cardboard box, be able to go to school? How? Aside from forced evictions, we have the criminalization of poverty. And we have the criminalization of the livelihoods of the urban poor, which fail to recognize, these practices fail to recognize that the urban poor must and will make a living, and that the only way they can do that is when there's a market, for example, in hold-up. So they're serving a market, and they're also serving their own needs. But despite that, what we see is that every day in Lagos, there are people who are arrested because they are poor, because they look poor. They're taken to the mobile court, they're prosecuted, and they're sent to Kirikiri for a crime called wandering without evident means of livelihood. This crime, in fact, of wandering, was something that was inherited from the British, and during the military regime in 1989, it was abolished. So why are we still seeing it here today in 2018? Ask yourself, should people be prosecuted and sent to prison for poverty? And even at that, we still see that street traders who are out making a living, selling us drinks in hold-up, selling us plantain, bodybuilding equipment, and whatever else he mentioned before, those people are also arrested and charged with street trading. Their wares are forfeited to the state, and they're made to pay a fine or a bribe, or both, just to avoid going to Kirikiri. In short, what little wealth they have accumulated is set back to zero or below because they fall into debt, just to be able to escape and go back to their lives. This is a picture from the Lagos State Mobile Court at Oshodi. This is just one day worth of people who've been brought for the market there. Third, we have this approach or interest in trying to, or I'll even say obsession, in trying to stop or reverse the migration of poor people to the city, which frankly speaking is unrealistic in today's Nigeria, where we have violent conflict from the northeast to the middle belt and little meaningful development in the rural areas except what's being financed from remittances sent from the cities. Urban poverty reflects national poverty. And the poor people living in the city are actually part of the solution, even if it's an imperfect one. Meanwhile, the proposition that destroying the homes and livelihoods of the urban poor is somehow going to reduce the number of poor people living in the city is, to me, just as delusional as the dream that Lagos will or should be the next Dubai. Lagos doesn't need to be the next Dubai, it needs to be Lagos. And what we see is that poor people who are trading on the streets, after they're arrested, they go back to trading because there are no alternatives. When one informal settlement is demolished, people move to another informal settlement because there are no alternatives. And when we see the state consolidating long-distance bus parks to the outskirts of the city, and arresting poor people because they look poor or because they're living with disabilities upon arrival, because they assume that they may be destined for street begging, what we see is not only an unconstitutional Band-Aid on a gaping wound, but a failure to recognize that the urban poor are already here. If we want to really fight urban poverty, we must stop fighting the urban poor. We must work hand in hand with the urban poor to try to find solutions and support the solutions that they already have to the problems that they are facing. We need to listen and talk to them. We need to share information and ideas. We need to plan together. We need to fully and firmly commit ourselves to one of the slogans of the Nigerian Slum and Informal Settlement Federation: nothing about us without us. If all this sounds idealistic, it's not. This is what I do in my daily work. This is a picture of a paralegal training that we run, and up till date, in the last 5 years, we've trained nearly 200 community paralegals just in Lagos, not including our work in Port Harcourt. They come from over 70 informal settlements across the city, and most of them have never gone beyond secondary school, if they've even finished secondary school. Despite that, they go through 6 months of training in various areas of the law, in alternative dispute resolution, and so on. And at the end, they sit for an exam, a 6-hour final exam that many lawyers have said reminds them of the bar exam. So if you've done it, you know. And after this, they work in their communities because they know the challenges and the problems of their communities. They know what their neighbors are passing through, and they help them to find solutions, armed with knowledge, armed with support, armed with referral networks. They help resolve problems between landlords and tenants. They help secure maintenance for children from parents who are defaulting and not meeting up with their responsibilities. They help their neighbors who've bought land from omuniles or land grabbers to actually try to perfect their title documents and register their land so that they can prevent land grab and extortion. They educate their communities about identity documents and how to go and get your national ID card so that you could, in the future, perhaps open a bank account. They organize their communities in the face of forced eviction threats, and they take those wherever they need to go with their advocacy to try to see a change to this practice. Not only have these paralegals assisted more than 7,000 individuals, urban poor individuals, over the last few years, they're starting to actually see a ripple effect and a change in practice. We have gotten injunctions to stop forced evictions. We have gotten a landmark judgment from the Lagos State High Court declaring that forced evictions, irrespective of tenure status, so long as there's not resettlement of the people who are being evicted, are unconstitutional. And we are starting to build a partnership with Lagos State government to demonstrate workable alternatives to eviction, led by communities, using their data, using information processes that they have put in place, and actually sitting down together with their government, together with experts, to plan for a better tomorrow, to plan for upgrading, to put in place toilets and solve the challenges like sanitation, water, electricity that they face. So, is all of this easy? No, it's not easy. Real participatory planning, real participatory development is long, complicated, and messy. But it's what we have to do. There is no silver bullet to solve urban poverty. Not a mobile phone, not a policy drafted in a Lausa. If we really want to solve urban poverty, it's the urban poor who will solve the problem, and all we can do is to offer our support, tools, and partnership to help them get there. Thank you very much.